Hello and welcome to our next lesson in this introductory module on how to use this course efficiently and effectively, and also the key concepts you need to know to understand everything else after this. This time around, this lesson is a bit more optional in my opinion, which scares me a little bit because it's about the ethical and moral side of financial analysis and financial modeling. But truthfully, you don't really need this to understand everything else afterward, though it will provide you with greater context, especially when we get to certain case studies. In line with some of the other somewhat random stories I've told you so far in this module about myself and my own personal background, I'm going to tell you a different story to explain this concept that'll lead us into more about the ethics of financial modeling. So in other words, beyond just looking at the numbers and understanding why you create a financial model, we went over that earlier to make investment decisions, to advise clients, and so on and so forth. Now I want to talk about how you actually think about the moral implications of those decisions and how they're going to impact the world at large. So I'll start with a random fact that you probably didn't know about me. You may know that I am borderline obsessed with TV shows and also series of novels, but you may not know that I am also a big fan of history and also a big fan of podcasts. So, of course, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History is easily my favorite podcast. If you haven't listened to it yet, and you are even slightly interested in history or historical fiction or anything like that, I highly recommend it. Now, in this series, he actually makes history interesting. So it's not like what you learned in school where you hear a bunch of boring facts and dates and blah, 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 and no one really cares about what's going on. He tells stories about different people and historical events and gives much greater context around what actually happened as a result. So the usual format is I'll go in and maybe do 4 or 5 episodes in a series on one topic, like World War I, or how the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Front of World War II, for example. But my favorite series that he's done, and also one of his most popular, is called The Wrath of the Khans, which, as the name implies, is about the Mongols from around the year 1200 to 1250. Now, of course, the Mongols made a big impact on the world well past that, really until the fall of the Yuan dynasty in the 1300s. But this just focuses more on the rise of the Mongols, especially under their leader, probably the most well-known Mongol of all time, Genghis Khan, also known as Genghis Khan or Chenghis Khan. There is some controversy over how you pronounce his name. Now, in this series, the main theme that he tries to address is whether or not this guy, Genghis Khan, the supreme leader of the Mongols, was actually a good influence on the world or not a good influence. And it's not exactly about good versus evil or right versus wrong. Everyone agrees that he killed tens of millions of people and destroyed a whole lot of cities, but a lot of people these days take a bit of a revisionist view. And they'll write history books and come out with other publications that argue, you know what, this guy, yes, he killed some people, he's a warrior, he's a battle commander, but there have been plenty of other battle commanders that have killed a lot of people as well, but we still regard them as heroes. And so a lot of the historians writing about this character now will say things like, he made Central Asia safe, he brought justice and liberty when he was in charge and when the Mongols were ruling their empire in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and East Asia. Bandits and robberies on all those routes were way down. It was much safer to travel back and forth. They argue that he helped connect China, the Middle East, and Europe. The Silk Road, of course, existed before he was in power, but partially as a result of what he did make these routes a lot safer and a lot faster to travel over. So a lot of people credit him with things like this. They'll even say that he granted religious tolerance and point out that when they conquered other countries or other people, they didn't force them to convert to their religion. They accepted whatever the other people worshipped and let them continue on with it. And then, of course, they top it off by pointing out that he was a military genius, and the Mongols did establish the largest contiguous empire ever in world history under his leadership. This shows the map actually about 50 years after he died, but you get the point. As a result of his leadership, they were able to expand to that extent. So, the host of this podcast, Dan Carlin, had been a longtime fan of the Mongols and Genghis Khan in particular. And he tells the story in one of his podcasts about a paper that he wrote in college analyzing their military tactics. And he focused heavily on how, even though they often came up against adversaries that outnumbered them greatly, they pretty much always prevailed. Now, they did end up losing some battles. They didn't invade Japan successfully. They actually lost in Vietnam and were forced to retreat from the Vietnamese. And there were a couple other occasions when they lost and were forced to go back. But there are generals that have won dozens of battles, over 60 battles in the case of one general. So you could argue that really they were the most successful army and most successful armed force in history. Maybe not the most successful, but certainly top 5 or top 10, a lot of people would say. And in his paper, he went into all the details and got very specific about flanking tactics and how they used their horses and their archers and all these other things, and went into a lot of detail. Now, to give you an idea of how good they were, some people actually think that even if you look at the time of Napoleon, about 600 years later, some people will argue that the Mongols probably could have beaten him, despite the fact that he had gunpowder. Now think about how crazy that is for a second. They're saying that the Mongols were so good that they could take their bows and arrows and beat a force of soldiers that actually has gunpowder and cannons. It's almost crazy when you think about it. And a lot of historians will say things like the Europeans probably couldn't have stood a chance against the Mongols until around 1900, maybe 1850 to 1900. Rifles hadn't yet evolved to the point where they were accurate enough and could be loaded fast enough until around that point in history. And his paper went into details on some of the factors that allowed them to be this good. So it was a very, very detailed and well-researched paper, but he got it back and actually got a very poor grade on it, at least 2 letter grades worse than what he expected. So I'm assuming it was probably a C+, because he's probably expecting an A+ on the paper. And he went to his professor and then asked him very simply, why? What happened? This paper was so well researched. I had all these details. I cited all my sources. I had so much of a persuasive argument. What happened here? And the professor replied with a simple question. What about the dead bodies? This painting is from the Mongols' siege of Baghdad, also in the 13th century. And the professor was pointing out that yes, they accomplished a lot. They were arguably the greatest military force of all time, but by only focusing on the military tactics, you've forgotten the human toll. You have forgotten about what actually happened here to the tens of millions of people that died as a direct result of these people. I just showed you what that looked like, the siege on Baghdad in the 13th century, but they did a lot more than this. At this point in time, probably the 2 greatest cities in the world, Beijing, which was known as Zhongdu back then, and then Baghdad. And they didn't just stop here, of course. They sieged and massacred plenty of other cities. And you can just look online and find paintings and images for all this. These are a few other cities in China. They also invaded Eastern Europe and Russia and all sorts of other places, and slaughter followed wherever they went. And when I say that they destroyed the 2 greatest cities, I don't just mean that they attacked them and they forced the cities to surrender. They literally burned these cities to the ground and killed everyone there. So this is not like a typical battle from, say, the 1800s or early 1900s where you're all lined up and you start firing on each other and eventually one side surrenders. This is, if you lose, every single person dies and this city ceases to exist. Now, of course, both these cities eventually rebuilt, but the point remains they wreaked massive destruction on all these places. They slaughtered about 10% of the world's population, and to give you an idea of what that means, just to put these numbers in context, you can see Wikipedia estimates 30 million to 40 million deaths as a result of the Mongol conquests. The world population in the year 1200 was only around 400 million. So what would it be like today if you had someone or a country or an army that killed 10% of the world's population? Well, here's what the world looks like today. We're assuming that all these continents are populated. What would it look like if 10% of the people on Earth actually died as a result of this? You can delete North America and South America, and that's about what it would look like. Now, actually, it's a little bit more than 10% of the world's population. It's actually closer to 15%, but you know how it goes. I had to do that because it was just easier artistically to remove those two continents. So can you imagine that? Imagine if today there were some natural disaster or some catastrophic event that just wiped out North America and South America. Every single person and living thing there dies. Maybe some plants and animals survive, but all the people there die. They're completely gone. Imagine how different the world would be, and imagine how many hundreds of millions of people, almost a billion people as I record this, would lose their lives. And that's a little bit what the Mongol invasions were like back in the 1200s. So, what's the point of all this? I've told you a lot about history and podcasts and battles and Genghis Khan and Mongols, but how does this relate to financial modeling and what we're learning in the course? So, first off, I'm not trying to make the argument that you're killing people or destroying cities with Excel. Bankers and financiers have been endlessly attacked by the media and lots of other sources like that. And I don't really want to get into that argument. I'm not in the business of trying to vilify people in the industry. It is what it is, and I don't really comment on those types of issues. So it's not about saying, yes, if you join an investment bank, then you have the same effect as Genghis Khan did, invading these countries and killing all these people. So it's not about that. The point is, though, that your decisions as a result of the work you do are making an impact on the world. So we don't think it's correct to just learn the formulas without learning the consequences of what you're saying. So going back to this history analogy, if you just learn the formulas in Excel and you learn how to enter everything, but you don't learn the consequences, it's sort of like the host of the podcast did when he wrote that very detailed and well-researched paper on the Mongols and their military tactics, but he failed to consider the moral consequences. He failed to consider that he was saying, you know what, it's okay if they killed 40 million people because their tactics were so interesting, they were ahead of armies for hundreds of years after that. That's a little bit like what it's saying. So this point really goes beyond just the why and the what next. We talked about a little bit of that in the previous lessons where we went through the purpose of financial modeling and how you actually use it in real life. You saw some of the case studies that we're going to go through in this course. But here I want to present the case that you also need to consider the moral implications of what you're doing. And to save you some time, you're not going to learn about any of this in other courses or books. I've looked, trust me, no one cares about it. There are some references that are very good on the technical details, but they have almost no consideration, really no consideration at all given to these types of issues. So we're going to go through a few examples now of how you might consider the moral and ethical side of investments and also advising companies on deals if you're more on the investment banking side. I'm going to start with a rather extreme example just to illustrate the pitfalls of always sticking to your numbers in Excel and always sticking to the answer and the output that you get there, as opposed to considering the full picture and also thinking about the ethical side and some of the moral dilemmas you might face. So let's say you have a new investment opportunity. The asking price is about 50% less than the net present value. So someone goes to you, they say they have a business, they're looking for outside investors, and they're willing to give you a great deal because you've run the numbers on their business, they've given you revenue and cash flow projections, and you think their asking price is about 50% less than what the business is really worth. And then even better, you've also run the numbers and you think the internal rate of return is 20%, and your opportunity cost right now is about 10%. You make about 10% by investing in other companies in this market or other types of investments in general. Now, in addition, this company also has a ton of pricing power. They have no major competitors because they've literally knocked out all the other companies in the market. They're so far ahead of everyone else. And since their product is so much better, they can really price it at almost anything and still be successful and still make sales. You've also run the numbers and figured out that even in the worst case scenario, you're not going to lose money because you'll get at least your initial investment back and maybe something for the opportunity cost as well. But no matter what happens, you are not going to lose money here. And then even better, they throw in an added bonus, which is that you won't have to disclose anything to the tax authorities. So far, it seems like this is almost too good to be true because you very rarely find opportunities like this in real life. And based on everything we've learned so far, you might look at this and say, okay, well, clearly I would invest in this company or this business opportunity. Why would I not want to do that? But then the punchline comes and they reveal what the business actually is. And it turns out that you're actually funding Walter White and Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad to start a new lab to cook crystal meth and to become not only the leading drug dealers in the southwestern part of the US, but also in the entire country. And of course, at this point, you, like most people, would walk away and say, yeah, that's nice, I can make money, but I'm not going to go to jail, and I'm not going to fund a bunch of drug dealers to ruin people's lives. So this is admittedly a very extreme example, but I wanted to start out with this, and then we'll look at some subtler examples to show you what actually comes up more often in real life. Now, the first example I want to go through is definitely a lot more of a gray line, but it is still drug related actually. And this goes back to one of the case studies we look at in the course based on Jazz Pharmaceuticals. So if you recall from the first few lessons, we said that they're undervalued by about 30 to 40% at the time when we look at them. They also have monopoly pricing power because their key drug Xyrem is protected by patents. And so in our opinion, it means that they can raise the price to almost any level they want without any serious repercussions. So once again, we have a case where the asking price of the company is quite a bit less than its net present value. They have a lot of pricing power. They have no major competitors because they have a monopoly on this drug and on this market. And we think that the stock price is poised to increase by a lot. Even if you object to this and you say, well, okay, they can raise prices, but should we really be investing in a monopoly like this, even if it's only temporary? Someone else could easily go in and argue, well, insurance companies or governments, if you're in Europe, pay the price, so who really cares about this? It's not as if the patients are going to be directly impacted. We're not asking them to pay ridiculous prices. They're paying very small portions or nothing at all, and then other firms or other governments are picking up the tab. But this is a good example of where you could easily make an argument that they're actually just exploiting people. I've pasted in here some comments online about the pricing of their product. They increased it from $1,000 to $7,000 over the course of 7 or 8 years. And keep in mind, these are monthly prices. So it is exorbitantly priced. Really, almost no one could actually afford this unless the insurance company is covering almost the entire cost, if not the entire cost. So we could easily look at this and say, yes, the company is undervalued, but is it morally correct to actually invest in them? Because it seems like they're sort of exploiting the system and loopholes in the system. Yes, their drug helps people who have cataplexy or narcolepsy and who cannot function otherwise or have normal jobs or do anything, but they're making a lot of money off them. They have extremely high profit margins. And so even though the numbers look very favorable, is it morally correct to actually invest in this company? Even though we could make money, should we make money, in other words? And there isn't really a clear answer to that question. Different people will argue different things. Some people will say, well, of course, it's fine. That's just how the system is. They're making a product that legitimately helps people. They're not killing them with crystal meth like Walter White and Jesse Pinkman are. So what's the problem? This is just how it is. Other people will say that as a result of their policies, though, they're pushing up the premiums for non-patients. They're pushing up the prices that insurance companies charge to everyone else. So there are different ways of looking at this. And the point is that with a company like this, it's really hard to say one way or the other whether or not they're doing something that is ethically questionable, because you could easily argue it either way here. Now here's another example of where this comes up. This is in another case study on a merger or acquisition between Men's Warehouse and Joseph A. Bank, two mid-sized men's retailers, both focused on the middle class and upper to middle class. And the key question in this case study is, does the merger make financial sense? So does it make sense for Men's Warehouse to acquire Joseph A. Bank at a certain share price and for certain deal terms? The conclusion we come to in the case study basically is yes, but only if they can realize a substantial amount of synergies. Now, synergies we'll define when we get to this set of lessons on M&A deals and merger models, but essentially they are opportunities to cut costs or to increase revenue, and in this case it's mostly cutting costs. So this is an example of a deal that only makes sense if they cut costs by laying off and firing a good number of both companies' employees after the fact. Doing that will let them boost their profits, and then, according to a number of metrics we calculate, the deal makes financial sense. So this is another sort of moral dilemma, because as bankers, do we go to them and say, yes, go and fire your people, we want you to get the deal done, so do whatever it takes, and who cares? Those jobs are replaceable, you don't really need those people anyway, just go ahead and do it. Of course, we wouldn't phrase it exactly like that. Use all sorts of euphemisms to make it sound more palatable, but that's the basic idea here. Here's the problem, though. These employees that we're going to be firing after the fact could actually also be these companies' customers, because many of them fall into that middle class income segment. And so essentially here, we would be telling the company to fire the types of employees who could be their own customers in order to make the shareholders of the companies, who are presumably already wealthy if they own a lot of stock or if they're at an investment fund that invests in these companies, we're saying, you know what, fire these middle class people to make other rich people even richer in the process. And this is a real type of conflict that often comes up. Whose side are you on? Are you trying to help out the shareholders and the investors in the company, or the employees and the customers that actually make the company function in the first place? So this is another type of moral dilemma you come across. Now, in real life, I'll tell you right now that 99% of bankers wouldn't even think about this. They would just say, yes, fire people, do whatever it takes so I get paid. I might be exaggerating a little bit there, but in general, you will not see much of a discussion of this type of issue, but it is something that comes up, and it's something to be aware of. Because if you go in and tell them, yes, do this deal, then what you're really saying is, as a result of my advice, other people are going to lose their jobs. So again, I'm not saying that you should avoid these professions or that bankers are evil or anything like that. My point is that by giving clients advice and by making your own investment decisions, if you're on the buy side, there are moral questions that go along with that as well, and sometimes they are clear-cut, and sometimes they're not so clear-cut. As you can see from this graph, this shows what Pfizer has done after it acquires companies. Companies often acquire other companies and then effectively fire many of the people that they gain afterward. So it doesn't look too good, and it's one of the contributing factors to really the decline of the middle class in America. So those are a few examples of how these ethical dilemmas and moral decisions come up all the time, or at least in many cases when you're completing case studies and doing financial modeling. What should you do with this knowledge now? First off, you should just be aware of this issue and you should think about it when applicable. It doesn't always come up. There are going to be cases later on where we don't really think about these questions because they're just not that relevant to the case study in question. They're about things that don't directly impact consumers. So, for example, a company selling software to other companies, it's not quite as relevant there. Or, say, a low-cost airline. If it's a low-cost airline, it's really hard to make the case that they're cheating people out of money because it's already low cost by definition. But in some cases, it does come up, and when it does, you should think about it. It's not that relevant as a junior level person, but it does change as you move up the ladder and you become more senior. And so again, I'm not saying that bankers or financiers are going around killing people or sacking cities or anything like that, but they do impact the world for better or worse. And my only point here is that if you are in a decision or a client scenario or an investment scenario where you think your actions are going to make the world worse, then maybe you should reconsider your decision or reconsider working at the firm that you're currently at. And that's really the main conclusion that I wanted to get to here. So, to do a very quick recap and summary, you have to consider the ethical and moral side when you're advising companies and making investment decisions, because in a lot of cases, the numbers look good on paper, everything looks good, but you are doing something that may make a lot of other people worse off or may contribute to something negative happening to the world at large. And when that's possible, you should be conscious of it and you should be able to make a well informed decision that is also backed up by your own moral sensibility. That's it for this lesson. Coming up next, I'm going to give you an overview of how to use this course efficiently and effectively. There is a ton of material here. It's our longest course by hours of video and also by number of lessons. So I'm going to give you some tips on what to do if you have no time and you need to make a lot of progress very quickly and you just do not have more than a day or two or a week or a few weeks to go through everything here. So that's coming up next. I'm also going to give you there a PDF quick reference guide to all the lessons, what to focus on and what to skip to get the most out of the course in the least amount of time possible.